Hello everyone, here I would like to say something more about how I learned my languages, more specifically about how I organized my lessons or study sessions. So, what was the structure or content of my study session? Based on the structure of the lessons that were present in the textbooks that I was using, I came to a conclusion now, after several years of doing things like this, that for me, the most important, apart from learning pronunciation really well, is to learn grammar in the beginning. Of course, grammar cannot be learned in a void, and so in this process of learning grammar, I would also, of course, learn some vocabulary that is necessary for understanding the things presented in the grammatical explanations, and so on. For me, it's very important to learn pronunciation of the language really well, usually together with the related orthographical rules. So for me, it's a priority to learn this immediately in the beginning, to learn it as well as possible, so that I will not have to correct my pronunciation later on when I'm already used to something that I have maybe learned incorrectly. It takes some time and focus in the beginning. For some languages, it's quite straightforward. Some languages have more complex phonology, but as I already said, this should be learned immediately from the beginning for me. If the pronunciation rules for some language were more complex, like for French, I learned them step by step over the course of more days. If the pronunciation of the given language was more straightforward, it could be learned quickly, even within one day, like for Spanish. And thus, later on, when having solid foundations, it gets automated and more natural. I've always been training my pronunciation by reading everything I saw in the textbook aloud. I read it aloud using my mouth so that my mouth gets used to the language, to pronouncing the sounds of the language, and so on. It's good if the given textbook has some audio recorded. This can help, but sometimes it's not even quite necessary, and it can even slow me down because I have to search which recording to play, stop it, and so on. There's just too much hassle with it for me. Some books can have it done really well. Some had it recorded just in some really basic way, just to have something. It really depends on the materials that I used. But in general, it's useful to have the example pronunciation recorded so I can refer to it, especially for languages which have more complex phonology or which have the sounds that are unusual for me. This can really help if it's done, especially if it's done well. It can help with getting used to the accent and to the way the native speaker's speech sounds. If later on I watch some content, if I listen to some content to some native speakers, I can adjust the learned pronunciation to that which I actually hear, to how it's actually being used, but I have to have a solid base for this. Usually, my materials had some vocabulary which was being used in the given lesson. There was some introductory text to a lesson, and so on. Some other components of the lesson as well. I always arranged these elements that were presented in the textbook in my own order. I developed a specific order which worked or works best for me. In the beginning of the lesson, I just go through the word list once, if it is provided for that lesson, just in order to know what vocabulary will be used, but I'm not learning it explicitly. I usually don't learn or memorize most of the vocabulary explicitly or intentionally. As I said, most often I just go through it only once, and basically I'm trying to remember it after it's being used within some context. When I'm learning some language of which I can have some prior intuitive or partial understanding, for example, because I learned a similar language before, or because I can already speak a similar language, I can just follow the order usually provided and read the text first and then study grammar. But if the language is not that straightforward for me, I just go directly to the study of the grammatical rules for the given section, and only after that I go back to the text and go through it, reading, analyzing, translating, and so on. If the language, like Greek, Arabic, Chinese, has its own script, I start learning and practicing its reading and writing, immediately from the beginning. If the language doesn't have its own separate script, if it's just using Latin script or some modification with some diacritics or something, in this case I don't do the exercises in the textbook in written form. I usually just do them in spoken form. I solve and read them aloud, which also helps me to improve my pronunciation, and that's it. This increases the speed, which is an essential component that I need for the initial phase of learning a language. And in the end of the lesson, when I feel like it, I go through the introductory text again, read it again, maybe read once more some grammatical explanations. It depends. I should repeat that each of us is different. So the way I do things is definitely not a universal approach for everyone. It was only description of what I personally did when I was learning my languages. So this is all for now. Thank you very much for watching, and see you again next time. Goodbye.